Russia has made bombers more recently than that, but very few. I mean, so few they actually named them, a bit like warships. So, you're down into the really modern ones, you're down into, a dozen or 2 dozen flying. These older ones will be very hard for them to replace.
Timely as ever, Mark Urban is here, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Mark. Welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be here, Hugo.
Good to have you with us. So, look, the Prime Minister's been speaking this morning about defence. We are to be a battle-ready, armour-clad nation. We're also going to be 10 times more lethal by 2035. What did we actually learn?
Well, I guess we learned that there is a shift in national priorities, and we've had some of this before, back at Easter time, that he signalled the move to this 2.5% target on defence spending. That's as a proportion of our economic output. And what that means in practical terms is about another $5 billion a year on a £53 billion defence budget. But now the big question is, given all the ambitions we're hearing about this morning, more nuclear submarines, more warships, that's a bit further down the line. Can we really afford those? The suggestion is that we'll go to 3%, which is about 14 billion a year extra on defence, 3% of the economy. And is that going to happen, or are the armed forces getting themselves, yet again, the long post-war story, into a situation where they've got all these aspirations for more ships or planes or missiles or whatever, but they can't quite afford it? And that's in a sense the big question about this. Is the commitment to 3% rock solid? And then going down the line, thinking maybe about where we'll be 6-7 years' time. Maybe we'll be post-Trump, maybe we'll be post-Putin. And the Treasury might start saying, do you know what, we don't still need to spend this much.
Well, I mean, what's the sort of the precedent here? I mean, when we have these kind of defence and security reviews, and the last one was 10 years ago, do we tend to end up making good on them or not?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. Well, what they tend to be is trying to funnel what the MOD has put into its wish list on a 10-year basis into a 3 years into the future cash flow basis, because the Treasury works 3 years into the future. So generally speaking, all the reviews we've had in the last 20-30 years have involved cuts to try and make things squeeze in, and a few sort of shiny new announcements to try and distract people from the cuts.
Right.
This is different. This is about recapitalisation, and you'll hear phrases like that. What does it mean? It means that actually we've got so few missiles, torpedoes, shells for guns and stuff like that actually we couldn't fight for more than literally a week or a few days, depends on the weapon. So the first step, and it is funded, the money is there for this, is to start building up those stocks again, so that if something bad were to happen, British troops in Estonia or whatever it is in the world, they could actually fight. They wouldn't run out of bullets after. So that's the first step. And then you get into the more complex question about, well, what do we want to rebuild, and what do we say, well, in which areas do we say, actually, technology has moved so quickly with drones and all the rest, we don't want to rebuild capabilities X, Y, and Z, because everything's moved on. We want something new and different.
This is precisely what I wanted to ask you about, because over the weekend we saw what modern warfare might look like. The Operation Spider's Web in Ukraine, basically, they appear to have taken out a great number of Russian bombers by launching drones out of trucks that was smuggled in. That kind of thing is happening. That's what some degree of modern warfare looks like. We're still talking about nuclear submarines. Is something awry here?
Well, look, a country's ability to use force is a hugely complex thing. Even if you just talk about the army or just talk about what happens at sea, you've got multiple different types of weapon, subsurface, surface, air. Then you try and defend against those. Then you try and attack using. So there's so many different variables here. Now, it is definitely the case that autonomous weapons, those things without crews in, both on the sea and, of course, in the air, are completely reshaping the way people think about war.
These things are the size of a lunchbox,
Yeah, well, they're really small. And, of course, the truth about the ones that the Ukrainians used against these bomber bases, which are the so-called FPV, first-person view drones, controlled by pilots sitting in Ukraine through the Russian telephone system, is they've only got a range of 5 to 10 kilometres. So those trucks with the fake roofs on the containers that contained these drones had to be parked really near the air bases. And this is why this operation was 18 months in preparation. Obviously, they had to think about the method of attack, develop it, et cetera, get them into place. Now, of course, there'll be some targets where you can't do that. The locals or whatever will be sufficiently vigilant that, trying to drive a truck up to, just outside the fence of the airbase.
Outside Lossiemouth, for example.
Is not, it's not an option. But, UK has to consider, and there's stuff on that in this review about, well, okay, if it doesn't even have to be states, what if an organisation like the Houthi militia in Yemen had the ability to fly drones and things to the UK? They attacked British warships last year. Would they use that to try and do something similar, that ability, to our Air Force in Cyprus or in the UK if they had the ability? So all of those things have to be considered, and it's such a complex question, as to what do you need to spend the money on. And with a thing like a submarine, if you press the button now and the submarine only appears in 2035 or something like that, will you still need it? Will technology have moved on to the point where submarines can be seen underwater by, reading the ripples on the surface? All these different things that people are spending research and development money on.
This attack in Ukraine, how much do we know about by Ukraine and on Russia, how much do we know about how effective it was? Because you've got Russia claiming little damage was done, and you've got other claims that $7 billion worth of damage was done and it's taken out a quarter of Russia's long-range air force. Where would you sit?
I'd sit somewhere in the middle. They obviously have destroyed some of these bombers, and the Russians have found over the years that these, what you call strategic bombers, i.e., they're aircraft with a very long range, and they carry a lot of cruise missiles, and they've been used to fire cruise missiles at Ukraine repeatedly during this war, which is obviously what makes them the legitimate target. They're very hard to build and replace, and there's you might have seen the images of these big things that look almost like airliners, Tupolev Bear bombers. The Bear is a name that NATO gave to them. Well, these things were made, 45 years ago. And Russia has made bombers more recently than that, but very few. I mean, so few they actually named them, a bit like warships. So, you're down into the really modern ones, you're down into, a dozen or 2 dozen flying. These older ones will be very hard for them to replace. Now, how many of the Ukrainians destroyed? I would say several, based on what I've seen. But as we know from watching videos of conflict, you may see a flash and a bang, but is the thing on the receiving end actually destroyed? Is it damaged? It's fascinating. I think the people, the so-called open source intelligence analysts, which is a lot of private individuals, will be analysing the satellite photography over the next week or two to see whether there's just a black mark and some twisted wreckage, or whether they've actually been able to get some of those aircraft out of those bases.
Picking through the rubble, as it were. Look, since we came away from him, Keir Starmer's been asked how his plans will deter Russian aggression.
We need to be clear, when we say we're entering a new era, the level of threat and the instability is of a different order than all of us have experienced for quite some time now. And that is why I asked for this review to be done, which is I need an assessment of the threats that we face as they are now and as we think they're going to be over the next 5 or 10 years, and our current capability to ensure that our capability meets the threats that we face. And that's what I'm very pleased that this review has delivered today.
So it's utterly Russia-focused. And I guess one goes back, if one thinks 10 years ago, it would have been utterly Middle East-focused. So you've got to wonder what the focus would be 10 years from now.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate question, which is why a lot of people in the armed forces, they think in terms of capabilities or things, platforms. They use these awful jargon terms like that. With a thing like a frigate, it's a big warship. It can do various things, and that can range from, disaster relief in a hurricane through to fighting wars against a so-called peer adversary like Russia. But you're right. I mean, we might be in a different place. Equally, we might be in a place where it's much clearer that a state like China has emerged, in a challenging way. And, by then has taken Taiwan or whatever, and is making further demands in the South China Sea of its neighbours. It's so hard to know. But I think that the basic point that the Prime Minister we just heard him make about, global instability is the key to understanding why the reinvestment in defence is necessary.
But before I let you go, Mark, you've got a new book out this week called Tank. Can you give us even a small clue as to what it's about?
Yes, tanks. I mean, look, in some ways they symbolise everything we've been talking about.
Exactly where we are, sure.
Yeah, the traditional way of making war. And this, what I've done in the story is I've taken in a way the 10 greatest tanks in history. And that takes us right from the beginning to the present day in Ukraine and how tanks are or aren't proving their worth in Ukraine. And that's the aim of the book. It's out this week, so hopefully people will enjoy it.
Well, you listed your 10 favourite tanks in
well, most important. Yeah, the most important, I think, in the story.
You're not going to tell me you don't have a favourite tank?
Oh, that's, I thought of doing these a bit like sort of BAFTA categories and saying best British tank, British tank, Centurion.
But Centurion, okay, excellent. Boris Johnson, when he was PM, said the days of tank battles on the continent of Europe were over, and he was obviously proven wrong by the Ukraine war. How vital is the tank? How vital should we be thinking about the tank? And I mean, in terms of what Keir Starmer said today as well.
Well, the Ukraine war was curious in the sense that when the Russians were pushing towards Kiev and Kharkiv in the north of Ukraine, they lost dozens and dozens and dozens, and we saw them blowing up and the turrets being hurled. All these sort of images that seemed to ram home the point that, these things were death traps and were very vulnerable. And then the minute things stabilised, the Russians pulled back and Zelensky started thinking seriously about how do I retake those areas that the Russians have got. He started asking for tanks and reminding us all that if you want to go forward, just like in the First World War, it might be quite a short distance. It might be a couple of 100 yards between their trenches and yours. We've seen these pictures of sort of moonscapes in eastern Ukraine. But there are so many drones and guns and missiles and all the rest of it that would sweep that territory, that no man's land, that very like the 1916-17 problem that the British Army faced, you've got to decide how are you going to get soldiers across that territory, that exposed ground, alive in order to either capture your opponent's position or, retake your country, whatever. And basically, because people are squishy, soft things, you've got to wrap them in armour, and then you've got to make them mobile. And if you put a lot of armour on, something like a car-sized thing with wheels will just sink into the mud, so you put it on tracks. Then you say, well, it can't just be defenceless. We need to put a weapon on it, and then we'll put a turret on it. And then, you've effectively reinvented the tank. So they haven't found any other way to cross ground, with all these weapons, including drones, to kill people who try to do that, other than through a heavy armoured vehicle. And so I guess they're not finished yet.
One more question while I've got you, just back on drones and stuff and the extent to which they can replace things like tanks. Looking back at the last defence review, a lot of it was about what we called at the time drones, which were these huge kind of plane-sized things like called Reapers and similar. How well equipped are we with that kind of pilotless aircraft in Britain?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating story, the Reaper. I mean, the Reaper, as you say, it's the size of a small plane. It costs $30 million to buy one. It was fine when you needed something orbiting for 12 hours over the south of Afghanistan, and you realised that you'd need several different piloted aircraft to do that. They'd have to go back and refuel and all the rest of it. You've got an unpiloted air vehicle like a Reaper circling. It's got missiles on it. If suddenly they see something, you can engage it. The problem with that is, if you've got an enemy who can shoot down aeroplanes, which is not the Taliban, but is the Houthis, for example, who've shot down 19 Reapers in the past 18 months.
All ours? Or
No, American ones. Right. Yeah. Then that sort of concept doesn't really work. And then you have to go to other things. Now, a lot of what's been going on in Ukraine obviously is very short range. These are things not that different in size to the kind of hobbyists drones that people might enjoy experimenting with at the weekend, taking photographs or whatever. But I mean, right the way up to things that can go 1,500 kilometers into Russia, and they're like a light aircraft in size. And the ways to do that is either you make it something that only goes one way. You're not trying to keep it like a Reaper, which is a valuable thing. It's a suicide drone, effectively. Or you make it much stealthier. There are various ways to survive. But yes, we've learned from what we bought in the War on Terror years that actually those types of drone are not that useful when you're fighting a state enemy that can shoot down aircraft.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark Urban. And look, Tanker, that new book we were talking about, is published on Thursday. Times Plus members can get 20% off. Just go to timesbookshop.co.uk. Thank you very much, Mark, as always.